Looking down at the chocolate bar in her trembling hands, Kako Tanaka couldn't stop the bitter laughter that echoed through the limestone cave. Here she was, captured by the very enemies she'd been told were starving. And they were offering her food better than anything she'd tasted in months. The rich, sweet flavor was unlike anything she'd experienced in years of wartime deprivation. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Lost in the simple pleasure of eating something that actually tasted good, then reality hit her like a physical blow. Everything she'd been taught about American weakness was crumbling with each bite. Let me take you back to where this impossible story began. May 21st, 1945, in the pre-dawn darkness of Okinawa. 17-year-old Kako crouched in that limestone cave. Her white nursing uniform was torn and stained with blood and dirt. Around her, other members of the Himayori Student Corps whispered desperate prayers. American artillery shells thundered overhead. Each explosion sent limestone dust cascading from the cave ceiling like snow. For 3 months, these young women had served as frontline nurses in the most brutal battle of the Pacific War. They had volunteered believing they would work safely behind the lines. Clean hospitals, wounded heroes to tend. Japan's glorious final victory waiting ahead. Instead, they performed surgery by candlelight in underground caves, their medical supplies reduced to torn clothing and prayer. Kako clutched a rusty pair of scissors, the only surgical instrument she had left after weeks of treating soldiers whose wounds were beyond her training. She had been the brightest student in her high school class in Naha. Dreams of becoming a real doctor after the war ended in Japan's inevitable triumph. Now American voices echoed through the cave entrance, speaking broken Japanese words about surrender and medical help. Her first reaction wasn't fear. It was that bitter, disbelieving laughter. But why was Kako so certain these Americans couldn't possibly have real food to offer? These young women had been shaped by years of carefully planned propaganda. Propaganda that painted Americans as weak and Japanese as spiritually superior. They were daughters of a society preparing for total war since the early 1930s. Sachiko Yamamoto had been one of the most dedicated members of her school's patriotic society. At 18, she possessed intelligence and determination her teachers often praised, plus fierce loyalty to the emperor cultivated through years of mourning ceremonies. Patriotic songs, lectures about Japan's sacred mission to liberate Asia from Western colonialism. Sachiko had absorbed a worldview that portrayed Americans as materialistic cowards. They had grown soft from too much comfort and luxury. They were supposedly incapable of the sacrifice and spiritual dedication that characterized Japanese soldiers. Most importantly for these young women, American food supplies were supposedly failing completely. Japanese radio broadcasts claimed American cities were experiencing widespread famine. Their agricultural system had been devastated by labor shortages and poor planning. American soldiers were so undernourished they could barely function as a fighting force. The Imperial Japanese Navy's submarine campaign was said to be strangling American supply lines, reducing the enemy to desperate measures just to feed their own people. These beliefs weren't mere propaganda to Sachiko and her fellow students. They were articles of faith that shaped their understanding of duty and destiny. When they packed their few belongings alongside medical supplies, they genuinely believed they would work in secure facilities, while Japanese forces completed their inevitable victory over the weakened Americans. The reality on Okinawa couldn't have been more different from what they'd been promised. Michiko Sato had been working at a civilian hospital in Shuri before being pressed into military service. American forces were approaching the ancient capital of the Ryukyu Kingdom. At 19, she was slightly older than most Himayuri students. more medical training, better understanding of what war really meant for people caught in its path. Even her mature perspective hadn't prepared her for the systematic collapse of everything she'd been taught to believe. The Japanese forces she was supposed to support weren't invincible warriors of propaganda. They were exhausted, malnourished soldiers losing ground every day despite their desperate courage. Medical supplies that were supposed to be abundant were virtually non-existent, forcing her to perform amputations without anesthesia, dress wounds with strips torn from her own clothing. Most shocking was the food situation among Japanese forces. Rice rations that were supposed to sustain the defenders had dwindled to a few spoonfuls per day, often mixed with sawdust, ground corns, or whatever edible plants could be foraged from the devastated landscape. Meat had become a distant memory. Even basic vegetables were increasingly rare, as American bombardment made farming impossible. Supply ships failed to reach the island. We told ourselves that the Americans must be suffering even more than we were, Michiko would later recall. It was the only way to make sense of what was happening. If our enemies were as weak and hungry as we had been told, then our suffering had meaning. If they were not, then what were we fighting for? The psychological pressure was enormous for young women raised to believe in Japanese invincibility. Every day brought new evidence that the war wasn't proceeding as promised. Yet their education and training had given them no framework for understanding how such a thing could be possible. If Japan possessed superior spiritual strength, if Americans were as weak and demoralized as they'd been told, why were they losing? The contradiction created a cognitive dissonance these women struggled to resolve through increasingly desperate rationalizations. Perhaps Americans were only temporarily successful because they'd been helped by traitors within Japanese ranks. Perhaps Japanese forces were deliberately retreating to draw the enemy into a trap. Perhaps new secret weapons were being prepared to turn the tide at the last moment. But as American forces advanced across Okinawa, systematically destroying every Japanese stronghold despite fierce resistance, these explanations became increasingly difficult to maintain. The young women found themselves caring not just for wounded soldiers, but for civilians caught up in the fighting. Elderly people and children who were clearly starving and terrified. Refugees who spoke of entire villages being destroyed by American bombing raids. The glorious crusade to liberate Asia was beginning to look more like a catastrophe that had engulfed their entire world. Now, let me tell you what happened when these women first encountered their American captors. When Sachiko Yamamoto emerged from her cave on May 21st, with hands raised in surrender, she expected to be shot immediately, or subjected to the torture that Japanese propaganda had taught her to expect from American captors. Instead, she found herself facing American medics. They immediately began treating the wounded soldiers she had been caring for, providing medical attention far superior to anything she'd been able to offer in the cave. The Americans seemed to have unlimited supplies of bandages, antiseptics, and pain medication, resources that had been completely unavailable to Japanese medical personnel for months. When one medic offered her water and what appeared to be food, Sachiko stared at the strange package with complete bewilderment. The medic repeated a single word in broken Japanese that she'd heard before, but never experienced. Chocolatto. Sachiko had heard of chocolate, of course. It was mentioned in pre-war stories about Western luxury and decadence, but she had never actually seen any. In wartime Japan, even the wealthiest families had been reduced to making sweets from sweet potatoes, whatever sugar substitutes could be obtained through the rationing system. The idea that enemy soldiers were carrying around luxury items like chocolate seemed so absurd. She was convinced it must be some kind of trick. When she finally worked up courage to taste it, her reaction was immediate and overwhelming. That rich, sweet flavor was unlike anything she'd experienced in years of wartime deprivation. "I thought it had to be fake," she would later tell her American interrogators. "Surely the chocolate we had heard about in stories could not be real." Surely American soldiers could not have such things when we were told they were starving worse than we were. I convinced myself it must be made from mud or clay, some kind of elaborate deception to make us think they were wealthy when they were actually as desperate as we were. But the chocolate was real, and it was just the beginning of revelations that would completely overturn everything these young women had been taught. The processing of female Japanese prisoners took place at temporary medical facilities near the front lines. These women posed unique challenges for American forces who had little experience dealing with female enemy combatants. The first challenge was determining their legal status under international law. Most had been serving in medical or support roles rather than as combat personnel. Some had been students pressed into service. Others were trained medical professionals who had volunteered for military duty. What was immediately clear was their desperate physical condition. Most showed severe signs of malnutrition: hollow cheeks, sunken eyes, and clothes that hung loosely on their diminished frames. Many suffered from diseases caused by vitamin deficiencies. Scurvy, beriberi, and pellagra had become widespread among Japanese forces as supply lines collapsed and medical resources dwindled. Some were wounded from fighting. Others bore physical marks of weeks or months spent in underground caves without adequate food, sanitation, and medical care. American medical personnel who first encountered these women were struck not just by their physical condition, but by their obvious intelligence and education. Many spoke some English learned in school before the war. Their medical knowledge was often quite sophisticated, despite the primitive conditions they'd been working under. Dr. Sarah Chen, a Chinese-American psychiatrist assigned to work with civilian refugees and prisoners, was among the first to recognize the unique value these women might possess. Unlike male soldiers trained to provide only name, rank, and serial number if captured, these women had intimate knowledge of Japanese civilian society, medical systems, the daily reality of life in wartime Japan. All of this could prove invaluable to American intelligence efforts. But before any formal questioning could begin, their immediate medical needs had to be addressed. The treatment they received was guided by military necessity, medical ethics, and simple human compassion. This would profoundly shape their understanding of their American captors. The facilities where they were initially housed were basic, but comfortable by wartime standards. Clean beds with actual mattresses replaced the bare rock floors of caves where many had been living. Running water allowed them to wash properly for the first time in weeks or months. Medical care was provided by qualified doctors and nurses using equipment and supplies far superior to anything available to Japanese forces. But it was the food that created the most immediate and dramatic impact on their understanding of American capabilities and character. Yuki Nakamura had been among the last group of medical personnel evacuated from the collapsing Japanese position at Shuri Castle, one of the most important historical sites on Okinawa. As a trained pharmacist, she had been responsible for managing increasingly meager medical supplies available to Japanese forces, watching helplessly as essential drugs were exhausted and wounded soldiers suffered without adequate pain relief. Her first meal in American custody was served on a metal tray in what had been set up as a temporary mess hall. She stared at the contents of that tray for several minutes, unable to believe what she was seeing. There was actual meat, beef that appeared to be fresh rather than the preserved or canned varieties that had become impossible to obtain in Japan. The vegetables were crisp and colorful. clearly fresh rather than the wilted, half-rotten produce that had characterized Japanese military meals for months. The bread was soft and white, made from real wheat flour rather than the mixture of sawdust, rice hulls, and whatever grain could be found. Butter that was actually yellow rather than the gray, rancid substitute that had become standard in Japan. Milk that was clearly fresh rather than the increasingly rare powdered version. Most shocking of all was the quantity. This wasn't the carefully measured portions that characterized Japanese military rations, where every grain of rice was precious. This appeared to be a normal-sized meal with enough food to actually satisfy hunger. I could not understand how our enemies could have such food, Yuki later reflected. Everything we had been told about American supply problems, about their agricultural collapse, about their soldiers being reduced to eating grass and bark, it was all clearly false. But if that was false, what else had we been told that was not true? The psychological impact of this realization was immediate and profound. These young women had built their entire understanding of the war around the assumption that while Japan might be suffering temporary hardships, their enemies were suffering even more. The spiritual strength of the Japanese people would triumph over American material advantages because those advantages were largely fake, built on exploitation and destined to collapse under pressure. The abundance they encountered in American custody challenged every assumption they'd been raised with. This wasn't the America of Japanese propaganda, a weak, divided nation whose people were too soft and undisciplined to sustain a prolonged conflict. This was a society that seemed to possess resources and organizational capabilities that Japan could never hope to match. Some women initially refused to eat, convinced that accepting such food would be a betrayal of their duty to the emperor and their fallen comrades. Others worried the food might be poisoned or drugged, designed to make them compliant for questioning purposes. A few simply could not believe that what they were seeing was real, convinced it must be some kind of elaborate deception designed to break their morale. Tomoko Hayashi, who had been working as a pharmacist at a military hospital in Naha before its evacuation, maintained a partial fast for nearly a week after her capture. She would eat rice and vegetables, but refuse the meat, dairy products, and other items she considered excessive luxuries inappropriate for prisoners of war. She was convinced that accepting such abundance would somehow corrupt her spirit and make her unworthy of eventual return to Japan. The breakthrough came when Dr. Chen arranged for several Japanese-American personnel to speak with the women in their native language. These conversations helped the women understand that refusing to eat would not help Japan or honor their fallen comrades. When Tomoko finally accepted a complete meal including meat and dairy products, her emotional response was a mixture of gratitude for the nourishment her body desperately needed, and despair at what it implied about Japan's prospects in the war. The food was indeed excellent, probably better than anything she had eaten since before the war began. But its very quality forced her to confront the possibility that everything she'd been told about American weakness was not just wrong, but deliberately deceptive. If our enemies can feed their prisoners this well, while fighting a war on multiple continents, she asked Dr. Chen during one of their conversations, what does that tell us about their industrial capacity? What does that tell us about their ability to continue fighting for as long as necessary? The question revealed the depth of psychological transformation these women were undergoing. They were beginning to understand that the food they were being served wasn't an aberration or propaganda display, but a reflection of American industrial and agricultural capabilities that dwarfed anything Japan could hope to match. The casual abundance they witnessed daily was evidence of a society that could afford to be generous to its enemies, because it possessed resources that seemed almost unlimited by Japanese standards. By July 1945, new prisoners arrived from the Japanese homeland, bringing even more shocking revelations. Unlike the Okinawan women, who had been isolated on a distant battlefield, these newer arrivals had been working in hospitals and medical facilities in major Japanese cities right up until their evacuation or capture. Their accounts of conditions in Japan itself painted a picture of systematic starvation and social breakdown that went far beyond anything American intelligence had previously understood. Supervisor Hanako Suzuki arrived at the American detention facility in Hawaii in late July. She had been evacuated from a hospital in Kobe just days before the city was scheduled for another major bombing raid. At 28, she was significantly older than most other female prisoners. Over a decade of experience in military medical facilities. Intimate knowledge of the Japanese medical system's gradual collapse under the pressure of total war. Her first meal in American custody included items she later said she had not seen in over 3 years. Fresh vegetables that were crisp and colorful. Real meat that was tender and flavorful. White bread made from actual wheat flour. Dairy products that had not been mixed with chalk, starch, or other substitutes. But Suzuki's reaction was different from the wonder and confusion displayed by the younger prisoners. Instead of laughing or expressing amazement, she wept openly as she ate, overwhelmed not just by the abundance, but by what it implied about the systematic deception that had characterized Japanese wartime propaganda. I had been telling wounded soldiers that America was on the verge of starvation, she told Dr. Chen during one of their early conversations. I had been repeating official claims about American cities in chaos, about their food supplies failing, about their military running out of basic resources. And here I was, eating better in an American prison facility than I had eaten in my own home in Japan for years. How many soldiers had died believing the lies I had helped to spread? Suzuki's knowledge of conditions in the Japanese home islands was detailed and devastating. She described hospitals where surgical operations were being performed without anesthesia because morphine and other painkillers had been completely exhausted months earlier. Medical facilities that had been reduced to sterilizing instruments with sake because proper disinfectants were no longer available. Medical personnel were reusing bandages until they literally fell apart. Even basic medications like aspirin had become unavailable except on the black market. Most shocking of all, she provided detailed accounts of systematic starvation affecting even medical personnel in major Japanese cities. The official food ration for civilians had been reduced to less than 1,000 calories per day by summer 1945. But even these tiny allocations were often unavailable due to transportation breakdowns and supply disruptions caused by American bombing campaigns. Medical workers, despite their critical importance to the war effort, were receiving barely enough food to maintain basic bodily functions. Suzuki described colleagues who had become so weak from hunger they could barely stand during long operations. Medical students who had dropped out of training programs because they lacked physical strength to continue their studies. Nurses who had fainted from malnutrition while caring for patients. The irony was terrible, she explained to Dr. Chen. We were supposed to be healing people, but we were all slowly starving to death ourselves. The wounded soldiers we treated were often in better physical condition than the medical staff caring for them, because they at least received military rations, inadequate as they were. The contrast with American abundance became even more stark when Suzuki began to understand the scale of American medical capabilities. The facility where she was being held had better equipment than most major hospitals in Japan. X-ray machines that actually worked, surgical instruments that were properly sterilized, access to medications that had become completely unavailable in the Japanese Empire. When she learned that similar facilities existed throughout the American military system, supporting not just prisoners, but millions of American servicemen around the world, her understanding of the strategic balance began to shift fundamentally. I realized that we were not fighting a war against an enemy who was struggling with shortages like we were, she later reflected. We were fighting an enemy who had so much of everything that they could afford to treat their prisoners better than Japan was treating its own doctors and nurses. It was not a war between equals. It was a complete mismatch that could only end one way. The conversations that took place during meals often provided more valuable intelligence than formal questioning sessions could have produced. The relaxed atmosphere of shared eating, combined with the psychological impact of experiencing American abundance, created conditions where these women felt comfortable sharing their deepest concerns about the war. Many revealed detailed knowledge of conditions in Japanese cities that had been subjected to intensive bombing campaigns. Their accounts of hospitals overwhelmed with burn victims, of medical personnel struggling to treat massive numbers of casualties without adequate supplies or facilities, of entire urban areas being evacuated because they could no longer support human habitation. All of this provided American intelligence analysts with crucial insights into the effectiveness of the strategic bombing campaign. Perhaps most valuable was the information these women provided about Japanese civilian attitudes toward the war. Their accounts suggested that popular support for continued fighting was far more fragile than Japanese propaganda indicated. They described growing war weariness among medical personnel, increasing skepticism about official claims of imminent victory, quiet discussions about the possibility that Japan might need to seek peace terms to avoid complete destruction. These women became obsessed with understanding how America had achieved such abundance, while Japan had grown increasingly desperate. Their questions during medical examinations and informal conversations often revealed sophisticated understanding of economic and industrial principles despite their medical training. They wanted to know about American agricultural techniques, industrial organization, transportation systems, resource allocation methods that allowed such productivity even during wartime. The answers they received from sympathetic American personnel often completed the destruction of their faith in Japanese leadership and propaganda. They learned that American agricultural production had actually increased during the war years, supported by improved technology, better fertilizers, and massive government investment in farming infrastructure and transportation. Industrial capacity had expanded rather than contracted. New factories and production facilities being built even as existing facilities converted to military production at unprecedented scales. The submarine warfare that was supposed to have crippled American supply lines had failed to significantly impact either military or civilian food supplies. While American submarines had systematically destroyed Japanese merchant shipping and reduced Japan to near starvation. Perhaps most devastating of all was the gradual realization that Japanese leaders had known about American capabilities all along. These women learned that pre-war Japanese diplomatic and trade missions had visited America and seen its industrial capacity, agricultural wealth, and seemingly unlimited natural resources. Government officials had toured American factories, farms, and universities, documenting the technological and organizational advantages that made American productivity so much greater than Japan's. The decision to go to war had been made despite this knowledge, not in ignorance of it. They knew, Suzuki said during one particularly emotional conversation with Dr. Chen. Our leaders knew what America was capable of, and they chose to go to war anyway. They sent millions of people to die, fighting an enemy they knew we could not defeat. How can such a thing be possible? How can leaders betray their own people so completely? The question haunted many of these women as they struggled to reconcile their loyalty to Japan with their growing understanding of the war's true nature and likely outcome. When the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in early August, followed by Soviet entry into the war against Japan, the female Japanese prisoners who had experienced American abundance were among the first to understand the full implications of these developments. They had seen firsthand the vast industrial and technological capabilities that had made such weapons possible. They understood that Japan had no defense against such overwhelming force. Many of these women became informal advocates for Japanese surrender during the final weeks of the war, not because they had been forced by their captors, but because they had seen enough to understand that continued resistance would only lead to more suffering for their people. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, the women who had once laughed in disbelief at American chocolate found themselves in the unique position of serving as cultural bridges between former enemies. Many volunteered to serve as translators and cultural advisors during the immediate post-war period, using their medical training and language skills to help American occupation forces understand Japanese society and customs. The legacy of these women's experiences would extend far beyond the immediate post-war period. Many returned to Japan and became advocates for international understanding and cooperation, using their unique perspective to promote peace and reconciliation between former enemies. Sachiko Yamamoto returned to Okinawa and eventually became head of nursing at a major hospital in Naha. She maintained correspondence with several American medical personnel who had treated her during her captivity. In the 1960s, she helped establish an exchange program bringing American nurses to study in Japan, while sending Japanese nurses to train in American hospitals. Hanako Suzuki became one of Japan's leading advocates for international medical cooperation, helping to establish humanitarian medical missions throughout Asia and serving on the board of several international health organizations. The story of female Japanese prisoners of war and their encounters with American food during World War II ultimately reveals the power of basic human decency to overcome even the most carefully constructed systems of hatred and deception. These young women had been raised on propaganda that portrayed their enemies as inhuman monsters, yet they discovered caregivers who treated them with gentleness and generosity that their own government had been unable to provide in the final years of the war. Their initial laughter at American abundance, the seeming impossibility that enemies could possess such wealth while Japan suffered, gradually gave way to understanding. Such abundance wasn't weakness, but strength, not accident, but evidence of industrial and organizational capabilities that Japan could never hope to match. The transformation of these women from believers in Japanese propaganda to advocates for international understanding illustrates the fragility of even the most sophisticated systems of ideological control when confronted with direct experience of reality. No amount of education or indoctrination could withstand the simple truth revealed by sharing meals with former enemies who chose to treat them as human beings deserving of dignity and care. The chocolate that had seemed so impossible to Kako Tanaka in that cave on Okinawa. The beef stew that had brought Hanako Suzuki to tears. The fresh bread that had forced so many of these women to question everything they believed. These simple foods had become instruments of transformation more powerful than any weapon of war. They had revealed truth where lies had reigned, created understanding where hatred had flourished, demonstrated that even in the midst of total war, humanity could prevail over ideology. In the end, the female Japanese prisoners who laughed at American food when they first encountered it discovered something far more valuable than mere nutrition. They learned that abundance shared with enemies, kindness shown to those designated as foes, and dignity maintained even in victory were not signs of weakness, but expressions of a strength that no amount of military force could provide. Their journey from laughter to tears to understanding stands as testament to the enduring power of human connection to overcome even the most carefully constructed barriers of hatred and misunderstanding.